Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now this is the Outer Worlds Spacer's Choice Edition, a remaster of the original title with the narrative expansions included. It released in March 2023, about 3.5 years after the original, which I really enjoyed. If you're looking for an action RPG set in a colonised region of space, then I'd still very much recommend it. The game currently sits at a very positive rating according to Steam reviews. The aforementioned original game, that is. The Spacer's Choice version here though, well, this was certainly more divisive, mainly due to the reported performance problems that didn't just affect the PC release but current gen consoles as well. As you probably know by now though, examples of release now fix later games aren't exactly infrequent these days. Many titles that were considered problematic or unplayable at launch, Cyberpunk, are now in a much better place, and I think it's important we look at and test some of these to give you an up-to-date summary of what you can expect. In terms of visuals, well, it's often said that beauty is subjective. The original The Outer Worlds and the Spacer's Choice Edition do look noticeably different in some areas and not so much in others, but the question as to which looks better can only be answered on an individual basis. It's the performance numbers that are of the most interest to me, and this is where the answer should speak for itself. I've held off playing this for over 5 months in the hopes that any of the reported problems other players were having have been ironed out, and according to more recent reviews, this may actually be the case. Now, the suggested minimum system requirements for both games differ quite a bit, and what I always liked about the original was that it ran fairly well on really modest graphics cards. The GTX 560 Ti 448 here is a good example of that, and while the experience isn't exactly perfect, it is playable considering the age of this card and the fact we have just 1.2 gigs of VRAM. Unfortunately, I had no such luck with the Spacer's Choice Edition, which crashed when pressing continue or loading a save game. The game uses DX12 now according to the overlay, so I guess that's why, as older cards like this don't support it. I'm surprised we got as far as we did though. If you have an older card, then it's definitely worth sticking to the original release. I then tried my once high-end Radeon HD 7970, which again ran the original game just fine with solid frame rates at 1080p low. There were a few little dips and drops here and there, but not too much to worry about. The Spacer's Choice Edition did actually load this time around. Well, sort of, because not all of the game loaded texture-wise, and even so it ran quite badly, especially as we approached a busy town or settlement. I can't really complain too much. I mean, the card is outdated. I just wanted to sort of reinforce my recommendation regarding playing the original if you have an older graphics card or just lower end specs in general. I think the previous issues were down to a hardware or legacy driver issue, because modern AMD cards like the entry level 6500 XT here will render the entire game, not just parts of it. For at least 60 FPS with a card like this, we are still limited to the low preset, and after going back and forth once again between this and the original, I think I've come to the conclusion that the original game looks better at lower settings, but the newer game, Spacer's Choice, looks better at higher settings. It also seems as though the Spacer's Choice Edition now exhibits better frame time consistency. I know it runs worse on average, but there are far less frame drops as we move between different areas. This could very well vary from hardware to hardware though. To finalise, I tested the game with the very high settings on my RTX 4060, and it seems as though the same was true. The original release ran better overall, but the newer release ran more consistently. If you've got the graphical horsepower to run the Spacer's Choice Edition smoothly, then it does seem much better these days, at least in comparison to what I was reading before I started this test. I thought we'd still be stuttering all over the place, but that doesn't seem to be the case at all. The newer game will run with a much lower average for sure, sometimes without much in the way of visuals to show for it, but I'm glad I waited almost half a year since launch to play this edition, because it certainly seems like it has been improved quite a bit, and there isn't much coverage on it these months later. FSR2 is also worth mentioning. This is a new addition to the Spacer's Choice game. Enabling this can help close the performance gap between the two versions of the game, especially if you use a more aggressive preset like Balanced, which will look a little softer than native, but this upscaling method can be really helpful. But there we go, The Outer Worlds Spacer's Choice Edition, a somewhat controversial remaster that has definitely been improved since launch. I wanted to take a look at this today because there isn't much coverage of this in 2023, and the original was one of my favourite games, still is. In fact, I wanted to see just how things had improved with the remastered version, and in accordance with a lot of what I've been reading on Steam reviews, it seems that from my experience there have been some improvements too. It is up to you, of course, whether or not you want to play the original or the Spacer's Choice game, but let me know in the comments what you think. Leave a like if you enjoyed it, leave a dislike if you didn't, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.